Hello again here at Chic. Have you ever tried to find out how to bind a quilt and ended up scratching your head? It's not easy to find the best info about the finishing touches on a quilt. Who wants to mess with all those corners and nearly invisible stitching? Sometimes it seems like enough to have a pretty quilt top. But finishing and adding that binding really takes a project to the next level. I have 3 different methods to sew a binding onto a quilt. Each method has its own unique characteristics, pros and cons. I'm going to show you all of them and how to make for a professional finish. So I have 3 test strips prepared here, and this is how they look in the beginning. And now this is how they look at the end. And I'll show you how to get this done. Let's get over to the machine. So I have basically 3 different methods. The first one is stitch in the ditch. For this method, I recommend to have a 2¼ inch wide strip, which really covers the seam line on the back side. I use a stitch in the ditch foot. I use a transparent thread to feed my needle, and for the bobbin I use a color matching my back side of the quilt. Though the advantage of this method is it's very quick, but the disadvantage could be that on the back side it's not always very perfectly parallel top stitched. My blind stitch foot guides me along my binding very well. This is how my binding looks on the back side. On the front it's nearly invisible. Method 2 is a decorative stitch. I use a 2-inch binding strip, and you see in my machine settings that I have a curved decorative stitch. The advantage is that you see a nicely stitched binding on top and on the back side. The disadvantage is, however, that your binding becomes a little bit stiff. If you don't have that specific decorative stitch on your machine, you can just go with a regular easy zigzag stitch. I threaded my needle and my bobbin with a cotton color matching my binding. And this is how your stitch looks on the front or on the back. Method 3 is hand stitching. Again, I start with a 2-inch wide strip. By the way, all my seams are 1/4 inch for sewing on the binding. Now I flip it over and hold it in place with my wonder clips, making sure that the seam is perfectly covered. The advantage of the hand stitching method is that you can not see the seam, but the disadvantage is that it takes really long to do it. So you start with a quilter's knot, you hide it underneath your binding, and then you catch about 1/4 inch of your underneath your seam line of your backing fabric, and then you catch about 2 threads from your binding and pull your thread through. And you repeat this step for the complete seam. You can speed up that process a little bit by pulling through, by stitching 3 stitches and then only then pulling through the complete length of your thread. So if you are someone who likes to listen to an audiobook or watch your favorite movie and hand stitch during that time, this method is perfect for you. Once you get to the end of your seam, you secure it again with a knot. And this is how it looks from the front, and this from the back side. Hey, that was easy, wasn't it? Just 3 straight little seams. Yeah, everyone can do that. So I would recommend that you give it a try and figure out which method suits you best. So now you will wonder, how did she all these corners, how did she connect start and ending of that binding strips? So to show you all that, we need a little project. And instead of having a complicated large quilt, we want to have something smaller. So I have prepared a pillow cover for that. See, this is what we will work on. So this pillow cover is part of my new upcoming book, Modern Building Blocks. And I have also a German and an English class on how to sew that pillow cover soon on Skillshare. This is especially for beginners. So as soon as these links are online, I will provide them in the description box below.
Before I now sew on the binding, I have to trim off my excess batting and backing, and I already basted the 3 layers with a large stitch to keep it together and have a little bit more of them fixed together. So now I trim off the excess fabric.
You see, the basting of all the 3 layers holds my envelope closure and all 3 layers in place. Next, I'm going to cut my binding strips. So the first cut is just to straighten the fabric which comes from the bolt. And now I start cutting 2 1/4 inch wide strips, since I plan to have the stitch in the ditch method for my pillow.
So.
Next, I want to mark the sewing lines by giving it a crease. Don't point the tips downwards. They have to point upwards in order to get a correct sewn together binding strip. On my machine, I place 1 strip perpendicular onto the other, and my crease gives me the direction where to sew. Then I can do chain piecing, flip the end of that strip over and place the next one on top of it. And again, sew along that grease. I cut the binding strips apart. Trim off the excess fabric to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Open my seams.
press them flat. And now I fold my complete strip lengthwise in half and press it all the way along. You want to avoid that your joint seams will later be on that corner. It would create too much of a bulk. So what you do is you test first how the corners and the joint seams will match. So when you start your binding, then you have a loose end of about 10 inches. So we start here and we clip it on and see where our joining seams will end. So this would be a corner, and this corner would also be okay. So fine. Let's see. Then the next thing, here is nothing to take care for. This is fine too. Okay. And then the next thing looks good too. Okay, let's go for that. And then the last piece looks fine too. Wait, all that up. So it's a good thing to test where your joint seams will be before you start sewing. So now we are all set up. I see this tail is too long, so I can already trim that off a bit like that. Okay, let's go over to the sewing machine. So when you now start, I leave a loose end about 1 hand width or 10 inch, you can say. And then I sew with a 1/4 inch seam, and you can even go to a stitch length of 3, because this is not a seam which needs to be stiff enough against tearing. So it is just that you speed up your process a bit with this 3-point stitch length. So okay, I go ahead now. Now, when you are close to the corner, what you want to do, you want to go about 1/4 inch before that end. I have a feed which has a little snippet on the side, so it indicates when that snippet is on that line, I am 1/4 inch away. If you don't have such a feed, you can either make a mark first with maybe a pin or a chalk pen, or you can maybe eyeball it. So I go ahead until that point. And then I lift my feet and I turn it to the 45-degree angle like that. And then my seam goes until this tip here. So let's cut it off. So to make it easier to see, this is the seam. It ends 1/4 inch before the cut, and then it turns in a 45-degree angle outwards. Now we build that corner. So what we do is we flip our binding strip, so it is now Now get that thread out of the way. So now this edge and the edge of the binding strip are both aligned, and you get a 45-degree angle here. So this is perfect. Now you flip it back in a way that your fold is exactly aligned with the edge of the binding here, and the edge of this binding is aligned with the edge of your quilt sandwich, like that. And to hold it in place, I give it a little clip, and then I start stitching, and I don't care if the line goes all to the end, because this little part here is in the seam allowance, and it doesn't affect how my corner can be turned later. So put it under my machine like that, go 3 stitches backward, and then straight sewing until the next corner. And you don't want to stretch the binding while you sew it on, otherwise it will flip back later, and then your pillowcase or your quilt, whatever, would then wrinkle. So hold it just loosely and flat in place. Now I have stitched all around, and you end with your strip about 10 inches before the beginning. So we have a huge gap here, which we need to connect to both. So how do we connect the beginning and the end of a strip? We want to avoid that such a seam goes into our closing, and fortunately the half of this gap here is before that bulk. Great. So I make a little mark here. So here's where I want to trim it off. And I use my 45-degree ruler, and I want to trim it this way along, like that. So this is our one end. Now, how long has the other end to be? So you see, if I lay that down, the other end has to be somewhere here, plus seam allowance. So I make myself a mark here with a chalk pen, and now I elongate a 45-degree angle from that point. Well, actually, I think it's even better if I make more kind of that mark here. So I have 2 points to refer to. This is now the point without seam allowance. So when I lay both onto each other, it is a closed piece. But I still need the seam allowance, and I need a 1/4 of an inch here and a 1/4 of an inch here, makes a 1/2 inch in total. But I go a little bit shorter because I want to avoid that we get kind of a mountain here. I rather want to have it a little bit stretched. So instead of adding a 1/2 of an inch, I add only, let's say, a 1/4 or 3/8 of an inch to that line. So like that. And now I have just to bring the bows together. I lay them onto each other, and this little tip shows off, and that's totally okay. Give it a pin. My pins are already a little bit distorted from other tasks I had to do. And pin it here. And pin it again. And I go just over to my machine, finish that seam and come back. So this is how I have joined the both ends. I can now open the seam and press it flat. I think it's good enough if I do that with my fingertips. Don't need an iron here. I also trim off these little dog ears like that. And if you see, it's perfectly aligned. It also already stretches a bit, but that's okay. Now I go and stitch it down here and be back in a minute. So next would be to press my binding towards the edge. And also when you come to the corner, you can this neatly press out. So later when you flip it around, it's a sharp corner here. It's really crucial that you stretch it, or otherwise, if it is not pressed until the edge, then you might end up with a bit too less of a binding to cover your seam. So you really need to firmly press it against the edge. So next step would be to flip your binding around, cover your seam, pin it in place, go to the machine. But what I prefer to do first is I like to take care of my corners before I go to the machine. Because you know what? When these are already stitched in place and fixed, then you don't have to handle that while you under your machine. So if you have that already prepared, then you can just go ahead with your running stitch all along without having that break for the corners in between. So what do I do with the corners? So you see this layer is underneath the corner and this is on top. And on the back side, I want to just have it the other way around to avoid too much bulk. So here on the back side, this has to be flipped first. So I flip it down and I hold it in place with a wonder clip. And next, this has to come over. So I flip that side around, hold it down with a wonder clip. Now I fold that flat and give it a good crease with a 45-degree angle to flip that over. And now I pin it in place like that. And also to fix it, I start with a stitch about an inch before the corner, go like that, and then end an inch after the corner to fix it. So let's do that. So now I pick this little thread here in the very corner and pick that very corner piece, and then I pull the thread very tight to close it like that. Make a double stitch like that. So now I have the choice. Either I go and close this opening here and can go upstairs and then downstairs on this side, or I leave it open, whatever your preference is. So I like to close mine. So, and I can go all the way through to the other side. And from here, I can go down and close this fold. Then I go all the way through straight to the back side again. And then I go about an inch here to close or to fix and hold in place that corner. Okay, I'm done. And I would do that now for all the 4 corners before even go over to my sewing machine. Because in my experience, it is easier to handle it out of the machine. And then later, when I am on the machine and I'm running along, I can just hold the needle in place, turn then my edge, and then go straight forward the other direction without having to deal with that corner, and everything keeps neatly in place. That's how I prefer to do it. For this pillow, I now use method 1, which I have explained. This is the quick method when I do stitch in the ditch and have a top stitch on the back side. So I have threaded my needle with an invisible thread. You can also go with a cotton thread matching your project color, or white in this case. And for the bobbin, I have used a black thread, so when I top stitch here along, the thread color doesn't show on the binding. Also, I have my blind stitch foot on, because this gives me a guidance for a stitch in a ditch. If you don't have such a thing, well, you just eyeball And I have set my stitch length to 3 to have a nice decorative stitch length on the top stitch for the back side. And because I've already taken care of all the corners and they are fixed, I don't have to think about that a minute. So I start with my top stitching or with my stitch in a ditch here and up on. Now when I come to the corner, this is all secure, so I can go until that point, then just lift the foot in and turn around. So this is how the binding looks from the front, and this is how it looks from the back side. Now we've finished our pillow cover, and now we have to bring in the filling.
Proper binding will beautifully hide the rough edges of all the layers of your quilt and make it look professional. Whatever style you choose, just use one of these methods to make binding fun, and your project can hang around for years to come. I hope you enjoyed sewing with us today, and if you want to learn more about how to make pillowcases and on, we have a complete list of tutorials in our channel in the playlist. We will link that above, and see you next time around. Bye bye.